Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching Alexander the Great Part 2 by Epic History TV. So, last time we saw the beginning of Alexander the Great's campaigns. We will be continuing that in this episode. If you guys end up enjoying this one, I would appreciate it if you would check out my Patreon, which is linked in the description down below, and will give you access to exclusive content. Anyway, with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction. Alright, part 2, let's get started.
In 334 BC, Alexander, the 21-year-old king of Macedonia, led a coalition of Greek forces against the greatest power of the age, the Persian Empire.
Yes, and last time we got the background on how Alexander's father Philip had basically united most of these Greek powers using force. He had met a premature end, and so Alexander took over, and where we left off was Alexander has made his way into Anatolia. He has conquered a little bit of territory, but he still has a long way to go to take on the entire Persian Empire.
He led an army of skilled veterans. At its heart, men of the Macedonian phalanx, armed with the 18-foot sarissa pike, and the elite horsemen of his companion cavalry.
Yes.
Together, at the Battle of the River Granicus, they'd won a first decisive victory over the Persian army. Now, as Alexander approached Sardis, capital of the Persian province of Lydia, its commander surrendered without a fight.
Ooh. Shows that Alexander's already making a bit of an impression, though once again remember, and when we zoom out and see this entire map, you'll see that this is the frontier territory of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. We are still far from the heartland of this very powerful and prosperous empire. And so you can look at the local lords and commanders of this region. They'll be a little bit more willing to give up without a fight or to change loyalties. So Alexander has just begun. He's already making an impression on the Persians, but he's got a long, long way to go.
But before Alexander could advance further, he needed to neutralize Persian naval power.
Ooh. Now this is very interesting. I feel like you hear a lot about Alexander's conquests on land, but not necessarily at sea, so this is a very interesting aspect.
Persia had a powerful fleet with major naval bases around the eastern Mediterranean that could potentially cut his lines of communication back to Greece. Rather than challenge the Persians at sea, Alexander decided to attack its nearest bases, the Greek coastal cities of Miletus and Halicarnassus. Both put up determined resistance, but were taken by winter.
Okay, interesting strategy. So instead of take on the Persians at sea, and to be fair, I do think some of these Greek city-states, which are now basically united under Alexander, had some pretty impressive naval capabilities, but instead of taking the Persians on at sea, he's cutting them off at land because they need these naval bases to stop at, resupply, and so he's cutting them off there.
The following spring of 333 BC, Alexander continued his advance into Lycia and Phrygia. At Gordium, he was shown the legendary Gordian Knot. A prophecy said that whoever could unpick it would rule all Asia. Alexander simply took his sword and sliced it in half.
Yes, this is a very famous story, and even if you're unfamiliar with Alexander, you've probably heard something about the Gordian Knot. You know, this knot super tangled up. The idea is that someone is to come and pick it apart, untangle it, but it's basically impossible. Alexander shows up, and I don't really know much about the legend. I've just heard about it, like most of you. Alexander arrives, and he just slices it in half. I'm not necessarily sure what the moral is supposed to be. Maybe don't overcomplicate things if you don't need to. Maybe this is supposed to show that, Alexander he's a guy who will just go for it, He'll just charge right in, and that's absolutely true of him more broadly. He doesn't try to disentangle this knot, pick it apart. He just slices right through it and gets the job done.
Meanwhile, Memnon of Rhodes, a skilled Greek general in Persian service, led Persian warships into the Aegean and captured the islands of Chios and Lesbos. But after Memnon's sudden death from illness, the offensive was abandoned.
The Battle of Issus? Not sure if that's how you pronounce it.
18 months had passed since Alexander's army crossed the Hellespont and invaded the Persian Empire.
Wow.
Now, Alexander led his men into Cilicia.
And now we're getting far. He's just reached eastern Anatolia, and soon he will be moving past Anatolia into the Levant.
Soon poised to cross the Nur Mountains into Syria.
Right.
But then, the main Persian army, led by King Darius III himself.
Yeah, and now you see the main Persian royal army, led by King Darius himself. This is because Alexander is getting much closer to that Persian heartland. He's got past Anatolia, much of which isn't super densely inhabited. Now you're reaching sort of the heartland of the Middle East. You're reaching places like Syria, Iraq. Of course, Iran is the center of the Persian Empire.
Emerged behind the Greek army to the north.
Okay.
Darius was determined to trap and destroy Alexander's army, which he outnumbered almost 2-1. So he blocked Alexander's only escape route by moving his army to the coastal plain near Issus, just 6 miles wide, from mountains to sea. The narrow battlefield would force Alexander to fight, but it also prevented Darius exploiting his huge numerical advantage.
Risky.
His army, by some estimates, was up to 100,000 strong, and contained some of the finest soldiers in his vast empire, including 10,000 of his own household troops, known as the Immortals.
The Immortals, these very famous, armored, disciplined Persian troops that will be around for a long, long time. A very famous unit of warfare, and I don't have the numbers on how many men were involved in this battle. I would say oftentimes these numbers are over-exaggerated, but when we're talking about, say, the Achaemenid Persian Empire, they would certainly be able to muster a very formidable number of men.
His best cavalry were massed on his right towards the sea, where the ground was better for horses. His best infantry, his Greek mercenary hoplites, formed the center.
And it's interesting to see that when we talk about the sort of infantry corps of each army, the infantry corps of Alexander's army were these phalanxes, these sort of disciplined, homebred troops. We look at the Persians, their best Persian troops would be their cavalry and the Immortals, and then sort of the center of their infantry, right in the center up front, are these Greek mercenary hoplites. It's sort of interesting to see how these different armies have different specialties. And I will also point out, very formidable Persian army. The Achaemenid Empire could muster a lot of men, but keep in mind, this is the Achaemenid Persian Empire past its peak. It is not at the height of its power necessarily. As we mentioned last time, it's already struggling a little bit. So keep that in mind when we're watching this entire series, because, well, they're going to go much further downward after this.
Persian infantry formed his left wing. Alexander deployed his own army for battle, once again entrusting his left wing, nearest the sea, to Parmenion, with the Greek cavalry and infantry. In the center, as always, was the Macedonian phalanx. Alexander positioned himself and his best troops on the right wing toward the mountain slopes. His elite Agriane javelin throwers, his archers, and behind them the hypaspists and the companion cavalry. When Alexander saw the strength of the Persian cavalry facing Parmenion on the left, he moved across his Thessalian cavalry to reinforce him. Despite his overwhelming numbers, Darius held his position behind a small river, the Pinarus, and waited for Alexander to attack. He didn't have to wait long.
So Darius does have seemingly a pretty big numerical advantage. He has also basically chosen the field of battle. He has a lot of advantages. Let's see if Alexander can turn things around.
Alexander called out to his men, urging them to fight bravely, picking out some by name. Then, at the head of his army's right wing, he charged.
Yeah, and I mentioned this last time. Alexander was, in many ways, a fantastic leader. And when I say that, I mean a fantastic leader on the ground. As in, he was brave, he was willing to charge in headfirst with his men, he had true confidence in his own ability to survive and thrive. Also, I believe he was quite an inspiring figure. He could give a speech, give a couple words to his men, inspire them, use his charisma to urge them forward. You know, these are the sort of traits you need in not only a strategic commander, someone who can pore over battle maps, direct troop movements and logistics, but someone who can get in front of his army and actually lead them into battle.
Once again, the speed and shock of the Macedonian advance sent the enemy reeling back. But in the center of the battlefield, the Macedonian phalanx was in trouble. In its effort to keep up with Alexander, its formation had become disordered.
I mean, look, we've talked about the phalanx before. The phalanx was this very sturdy organization of men, but one of the flaws was that it wasn't very mobile. It wasn't good at maneuvering, and it maybe wasn't as quick as other formations. And so if it needs to follow Alexander super quickly, you know, maybe it can speed up, but what you're going to lose is you're going to lose some of that organization, some of that discipline in the process. You know, no formation is perfect. There's always going to be pros and cons. You're going to give and take.
Now, in fierce fighting with Darius's Greek mercenaries, the phalanx was slowly being driven back.
Wow.
Alexander, seeing the danger...
And that is pretty remarkable, to be honest, the phalanx being pushed back. Because, remember, really the strength of this phalanx, we're talking about all these men lined up with these sarissas, these very long pikes. The strength is that they can stand shoulder to shoulder with these pikes pointed forward, sort of herding off enemies. But if you sort of get out of order, you know, maybe disorder is reigning a little bit, then you're going to lose a lot of that strength, and I guess you get into a situation like this where you're being slowly pushed back.
Regrouped and led the companions in a headlong charge straight at the Persian center. The Greek mercenaries threatened on their flank were soon in disarray, and the Macedonian phalanx was able to resume its advance. Alexander fought his way towards the great king Darius himself. Rather than face this apparently mad and fearless Macedonian king,
That's a good way of describing it. Apparently mad and fearless Macedonian king. And this is what I mean when I talk about, and I mentioned it last episode, Alexander's absolute confidence in himself. not only in his armies, in his leadership ability, but in his ability to survive. We talked about last time how he had, and there's some speculation around this, we're not entirely sure, but some ideas about himself being divine in some way. And so he literally may have believed that he could not die, or at least would not die until the time was right. So absolutely fearless, and some may call that mad. Regardless of what you call it, this man's gonna keep charging forward.
Darius fled the battlefield in his royal chariot.
And also, look at the juxtaposition there between Alexander on his horse, leading his men by himself, really getting into the thick of things, and Darius, the prosperous king of this big empire, being taken away in a chariot. Now, you don't necessarily want to assign too much meaning to that, it's one instance, but it does sort of seem symbolic for the larger conflict. Sort of this upstart Alexander with his upstart state, Macedonia, who, they're rough, they're tough, and they're ready to conquer. And then the big Persian Empire that has sort of, reached past its peak. It's resting on its laurels, it's comfortable, it's prosperous, but it just doesn't have that fighting spirit anymore. And once again, don't put too much importance on this one instance, but that does sort of seem to embody this larger point that one might make.
Meanwhile, the Macedonian left wing under Parmenion was in a desperate fight against the best of the Persian cavalry.
Ooh.
If the Persians could break through here, they could envelop Alexander's army and snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. But Parmenion and his troops fought doggedly and continued to hold the Persians at bay. As the news that Darius had fled spread among his troops, they abandoned the fight.
Well, yeah, if you have your king Alexander leading from the front, giving speeches, himself fighting, that's going to inspire y'all, push you guys forward. If you hear news that your king has fled from the battlefield, talk about demoralizing, right? That is probably the worst thing that could happen in terms of encouraging your men to keep going. When they hear that, they're going to say, well, he's left, he's abandoned us, let's get the hell out of here. Regardless of what the situation actually is.
And tried to save themselves.
Right.
The battle turned into a massacre. Ptolemy, one of the Macedonian commanders, told Alexander there were so many Persian dead, his men had used them to fill a deep ravine, so they could cross over it.
Ugh. Brutal. Son of Amun. Once again, don't come to me for the pronunciations.
The Battle of Issus was a stunning victory for Alexander. And amongst the spoils of victory were Darius's wife, mother, and 3 children.
Oh, wow.
All taken alive and well treated by Alexander.
Okay.
With the Persian field army in retreat, Alexander now turned to subduing the western territories of the Persian Empire.
Wow. Yeah, and if you look at this map, Alexander is basically now in the process of cutting the Persian Empire in 2. I won't say in half, but in 2. He's cutting off these western provinces from the eastern provinces. And so he's still not quite got to the heart of the Persian Empire, but he is about to try and take away some pretty important and pretty prosperous provinces.
The next year, 332, the coastal cities of Phoenicia submitted to Alexander, ending Persian naval power in the Mediterranean.
Wow, big
but
deal.
The island city of Tyre resisted. Tyre's defenders fought bravely and skillfully, even when Alexander began building a causeway to the island, protected by 2 giant siege towers, which they counterattacked with fire ships. But after 7 months, the city walls were breached and Tyre fell. Most of its citizens were killed or enslaved.
I mean, these appear to be some pretty brutal campaigns. You know, brutality was pretty common for this time period, but already, and we're only on part 2, we have seen our fair share of cities being destroyed, massacres, people being sold into slavery, etc., etc. But back to sort of the presence and the place of the Achaemenid Empire. You know, this isn't necessarily their heartland, but this Persian Empire has been spreading westwards for a while now. I mean, this is something we saw. They sort of wanted to make incursions into Greece. Didn't necessarily succeed, but, you know, they were trying to conquer more and more Western territory. And now Alexander is basically pushing the Persians back. They've reached out as far as they could, and now Alexander's cutting them off. In many ways from the Mediterranean, you know, the Persians are sort of having to reorient eastwards now.
Gaza, too, was taken by siege. Alexander continued to Pelusium on the Nile Delta, where the Persian governor of Egypt surrendered the entire province to Alexander, along with the royal treasury.
And that's a big W, even before the royal treasury. Obviously, that is a big, big win, but Egypt in general, now, Egypt has a long, long history. At times, it has been independent. At many points throughout its history, it has been part of a larger empire. But you look at Egypt in the ancient world, it is a place with a lot of history, a lot of culture, a lot of power, and often a lot of money. It's often a pretty prosperous territory to have. And so conquering Egypt, that's a big deal.
At Memphis, priests of this ancient land welcomed Alexander as their liberator from Persian rule and crowned him pharaoh.
Wow. And this is a pattern we will see repeated with Alexander. Now, you know, I don't necessarily know too much about Alexander, and I hope we see more of this throughout the series. Plus, I know there are some other videos on YouTube, and y'all can recommend more of them, that talk specifically about Alexander's experiences with particular people or cultures. But it really seems to me that Alexander would go to all of these different cultures and states and regions and would pick up a lot of the titles granted by these particular regions and sort of adopt some of their culture, some of their practices, bring them into his way of doing things, and also sort of spread a Macedonian or a Greek way of doing things. You know, he's sort of an interesting character, and I think his interaction with a lot of these different peoples is very fascinating.
At the mouth of the Nile, he founded a new city, Alexandria, then traveled to the desert oracle of Siwa.
And Alexandria would go on to be one of the most important cities of the region for, God, for what, hundreds and hundreds of years? I mean, Alexandria would really be sort of one of the main cities of the Mediterranean world at points. You know, there are a couple of big ones, and they change throughout the classical era of history, but Alexandria at times would be a really important city.
Where, according to some accounts, the priests welcomed him as son of Amun, king of the gods.
Ah, okay. That's what that was referencing.
Alexander returned east.
And by the way, it also shows you his intent on not only conquering these territories, but actually establishing himself as some sort of legitimate ruler. I mean, he has gone pretty far off the beaten path. He's not just moving straight eastwards from Macedonia to the Persian heartland to defeat the Persians and conquer their territory. He's making what could be seen as a bit of a diversion all the way to Egypt, this very prosperous province, in order to truly set up his rule, establish himself as a legitimate monarch, show himself to the people. I mean, this shows that, you know, not only is he a conqueror, but he is an actual leader. He is a ruler, and he's trying to achieve that.
To Tyre, where in 331 BC he received news of trouble back home.
Uh-oh.
Despite his great victories over the Persians, many Greeks regarded Alexander as a tyrant.
Yeah. Well, a lot of these Greek states were never that happy about any sort of Macedonian domination. It was Alexander's father, Philip, who had sort of brought these Greek states together, using, in many ways, coercion and force, and a lot of them really weren't happy about it. As we talked about last time, Macedonia was this upstart state to the north. A lot of these Greek states, for example, a place like Athens viewed them as not as cultured, as rough, barbarian in some sense of the word. And so they were not really pleased about this arrangement. And now that Alexander is a long, long way away, hey, maybe these Greek states can start to exert some power, some influence.
King Agis of Sparta, with Persian support, now launched a revolt against Macedonia.
Right, and Sparta was never truly subjugated. They were always kind of a problem for Macedonia. And so here, once again, we see them making a fuss.
Antipater, Alexander's commander in Greece, was already dealing with rebellion in Thrace. But he quickly marched south and met Agis in battle near the city of Megalopolis. Even the legendary Spartans were now no match for Macedonian military power.
Yeah.
The Spartan army was crushed. King Agis himself was among the fallen.
And as I mentioned last time, Sparta will fall into irrelevancy over time. It's sort of on its way out. When you think about ancient history, there's this period of sort of the rise of ancient Greece where you hear about Athens and Sparta, but after a certain point, you don't hear too much about Sparta anymore.
With his base in Greece secure once more, Alexander advanced towards the Persian heartlands.
All right,
seeking
back
a final
to Persia.
showdown with Darius. He received a letter from the Persian king offering him a fortune in gold, his daughter in marriage, and half his empire in exchange for peace.
So look at that, Darius is starting to get a little nervous. He's saying, okay, you know what? You have already taken a significant chunk of my empire, including some pretty prosperous territory, a la Egypt. So how about this? Why don't we make a bit of a peace deal? I'll give you some gold, half of my empire, my daughter's hand in marriage, and we can call this whole thing off. Do you guys think Alexander's going to accept that?
But Alexander's stunning victories, all the oracles and acclamations, had now convinced him that his destiny was to rule the world.
Yep, if he wasn't already convinced of that.
He rejected the Persian king's offer. He didn't want half the empire. He was coming to take it all.
Yes, he was.
Research and art.
Alright, fantastic video. And I'm actually going to go back a little bit to that map, because I think it's a good place to stop. Look at how massive this Persian Empire is, and this is why I keep repeating myself. Alexander hasn't reached the heart of the empire yet, but now he's heading for it. He's going straight for it. He's taken that sort of western chunk, that sort of Mediterranean portion of the Persian Empire. This is what I was saying when I was talking about how Persia, its center of power, its center of gravity, is not necessarily in Anatolia or Egypt. It's much further east, but it had been spreading westwards, taking a lot of this western territory, making incursions into Greek territory. Now Alexander's taken a lot of that. He's pushing them back, and not only that, he now is heading straight for their heartland. They're in a lot of trouble. He's going to do a lot more than just take half of their empire, but we'll have to wait for the rest of the series to see that, and I'm truly excited to get to that. We're only on episode 2, but I've enjoyed this series quite a bit so far, plus the series is only 4 episodes long, so at this point, we are roughly halfway through. Yeah, I've had a good time with this. Once again, if you guys have any other Alexander reactions you would like me to do, leave them in the comments down below. I know there's a lot of content on YouTube about Alexander the Great. I just wanted to start with this one because it's Epic History TV. They always do a fantastic job. I'm excited to see what Alexander gets up to next time. I think Darius is in for a bit of a hard time, but we'll see. We'll see. If you guys have enjoyed this reaction, please leave a like, subscribe, and check out the Patreon, which is linked down below. Anyway, with all of that out of the way, I hope you guys are having a good day today, and I will see you all again next time. Goodbye.